I just want to thank the AHA Foundation for inviting me here. It's been a real pleasure to work with them on this issue, and we are very lucky in that I feel like we are developing a great national coalition of service providers, allies, law enforcement, advocates who are helping us raise awareness about the problem of forced marriage and honor violence, and also out there to protect individuals who are facing these situations. So, like I said, my name's Heather Heiman. I'm the Senior Policy Attorney at the Tahirih Justice Center. We're a national legal service provider with offices in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, and Houston, Texas. We, like Manan said, we provide services to immigrant women and girls who are fleeing all forms of gender-based violence, whether it be forced marriage, honor violence, widow rituals, severe domestic violence, human trafficking. If it falls in the realm of gender-based violence, we'll definitely help. How about the woman or child who's fleeing it? Flip to the next. I'm here to talk a little bit about Tahirih's Forced Marriage Initiative, and more practically, though, I want to talk about identifying and responding to victims. We've had some really tragic cases shared today with some really horrific endings, and I think these case examples that we heard from the detective, from Nazir, they kind of illustrate the really high stakes that are involved in these cases and the very real threat of harm that's facing victims. But I want to encourage everyone, though, to really look, too, before those tragic endings. I think we need to also look at earlier, more subtle signs that there are problems, and try to do what we can to intervene before things escalate in such a way. And that's what we do at Tahirih, so I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that. The Forced Marriage Initiative that we run, we started it in 2007 because we had been getting calls for a number of years from individuals who are here in the United States, oftentimes U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, refugees, asylees, who are facing forced marriage situations either here in this country or potentially being taken abroad for a forced marriage, or facing some kind of honor violence situation. And we take a multifaceted approach to all the work that we do. We have a kind of a holistic client-based approach, and in addition to doing the direct legal services, we also do public policy advocacy, we do research, we do education and outreach, lots of trainings. I've been lucky enough to be invited by AHA a number of times. And with that kind of holistic component in mind, and also for a desire to better understand how this issue was playing out in the United States, we decided to launch a national survey trying to get a better understanding of the scope and nature of forced marriage in this country. Before I launch into some of the survey results, in the survey, I brought a number of copies. It's available outside. You guys can pick those up. And I have some information on my organization as well on my card. You can feel free to give me a call. Before I launch into exactly what the survey said, I want to just share with you our definition of forced marriage. This definition was crafted looking at the UK's example, definitions used in the UK, looking at definitions that are used by organizations in Canada, other countries around the world. And one thing we really wanted to make clear is first, the central element of that need for consent before a marriage is valid from both parties, and not just slight acquiescence, but real full and free consent. And also that there is a spectrum between forced and arranged marriages. And while this definition speaks to forced marriages, I also include a definition or a contrasting statement about what an arranged marriage is. And what I'd like to just have you guys know, and this is a big take-home for me, oftentimes I'll be dealing with a client or somebody who's in a situation of crisis who is describing something as an arranged marriage. Or maybe it started as an arranged marriage where initially she freely gave her consent. But there's a big gray area between an arranged marriage and a forced marriage. And we see very often cases where the individual is not at one end or the other, but somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Or throughout the case, throughout trying to assist an individual, they may be moving from one side of the spectrum to the other, usually from an arranged marriage to one where they're facing more and more coercion. If they try to put up any resistance to it, then there's the threat of force. Then there's the potential for violence, and it definitely moves into more of a forced marriage situation. So the survey that we conducted, and we were lucky enough to work with the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. and the National Academy of Sciences, and we used all of our networks. Tahirih is very active in the asylum community, just the national communities that work on domestic violence and sexual assault, both policymaking and legal services, and we blasted the survey out to everybody we possibly could. I remember my boss and I talking, we were like, man, if we get 50 responses, we're going to be so happy, because every time I talk to somebody about forced marriage in the U.S., one of the first things I hear is, oh, what do you mean? That doesn't happen in this country. Like, aren't you talking about overseas, you know? I don't think it was really on people's radar until a couple of years ago, unless you were living it, you were in those, in communities affected. People just kind of dismissed it as an issue and didn't see it within, like Nazir was commenting on, a human rights framework or something that falls within the domestic violence protections that we should be exercising for people. We were very lucky, though. We got over 500 responses during the course of the survey, which ran for 3 months, from 47 different states, all reporting back to us experiences that they had had with forced marriage, and the clients they saw and the service seekers they were helping, or unfortunately in the ones that they weren't able to help. The survey identified as many as 3,000 cases of forced marriage happening here in the United States in the last 2 years. I think this number is an underestimate, a severe underestimate. This survey was just the first stab at getting some kind of answer to the prevalence of the issue. And I look forward to AHA and to other organizations, and we ourselves are trying to continue to research this, dig a little bit deeper, and to get a better handle on how prevalent this is in the US and in which ways it's occurring. Close to half of respondents said they had encountered at least one case in that 2-year period, and many more said they had seen cases prior to that 2-year period that they were asked about. So you can see from this, I mean, it's definitely a serious issue here. And again, we need further research, we need further investigation to find out a little bit more about the depth and nature of this problem. I just want to share a few key findings, because I think that our experience in the United States is different than the experience of some of our colleagues in the UK, and it's different from other countries in Europe, and it's different from Canada, from Australia, other places where they're tackling this issue of forced marriage. And one of the baseline reasons for that is because we have different migration patterns. We have different kinds of people, different ethnic groups coming to this country, and it's going to definitely affect who is reporting these cases and what kind of situations we're seeing. The survey asked about family motivations. I just want to note that tradition was almost always checked. Actually, interestingly, it wasn't culture, religion, it was tradition. It was something that was brought down in the families that they just felt like they had experienced this, or this was how their marriages, their lives were arranged, and so their children had to follow in their footsteps. This is one thing that I always like to share, is the breadth of ethnic and cultural backgrounds that are affected by the issue of forced marriage. As you can see, we had respondents telling us they had encountered victims from 56 different countries. Most frequently mentioned, you can see India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. I know those are the top 3 in the UK. But up there too is Mexico. We had a number of countries from Africa mentioned, Asia, South America, Central America, Eastern Europe. It was amazing how often this occurs. And it occurs in different contexts. In some cultures, honor is very important in the way that Ayaan Hirsi Ali was describing it. And there's this very rigid code of conduct that women are expected to follow. In other cultures, there's also a sense of honor, but it manifests in different ways. You know, we had some stories come back to us of women who were raised Catholic or Christian, and having a pregnancy outside of marriage was just as much of a dishonor to their family, and sometimes the repercussions were just as severe. And you can see, too, religious backgrounds. It encompassed a lot of different faiths: Muslim, Christian, Hindu. Christian was actually the second most reported faith of people answering the survey. So again, I just don't want people to have blinders on as to when and where this issue can crop up. It manifests in different ways. We at Tahirih, I know we had one case that involved, it was actually an asylum case, so the individual wasn't a US citizen or legal permanent resident, but they were married off by their family. They were from Central America to protect against gang violence that was targeting their family. The brothers were actively being recruited by the gang, and as a way to kind of mitigate the situation, one of the leading gang members said, okay, well, he liked the sister, said, I want her to be my wife. And like, it was this negotiation the family did for their protection. So the motivations were a little bit different there. Maybe it didn't fall into that strict honor context, but it was for protection, for maintaining the family's safety. To me, though, oftentimes the warning signs are the same. The threat of abuse and violence is the same. So we just have to broaden our lenses when we're looking for victims. Because again, I'd rather be over-inclusive and provide remedies whenever we can than have a narrow vision of what this is. A lot of our findings very much paralleled what they see in the UK. Most frequently, the victims are young women. There were a lot of respondents that said they had encountered men, though, and oftentimes those cases were correlated with somebody coming out as being openly gay, and that was the trigger for a forced marriage or some kind of violent situation. And we also saw people were reporting to us that these cases were not just involving people being taken abroad back to their home country, which I think is a situation we've heard about again and again, but these marriages are occurring here in the United States. And it's interesting, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the marriage laws in this country are a challenge. We have 50 different states, 50 different ages, or actually the age of marriage is generally 18. But in many states, with parental consent, you can get married as young as 16. In a couple states, I believe New Hampshire, Massachusetts, it's like 13 for boys, 12 for girls with parental consent. And then there's some other states, I think 3 or 4, that have no minimum age of marriage at all on their statutes if you get either parental or judicial consent. So this makes it sometimes challenging to address this problem if the thing that's being checked is not the individual's consent, but the consent of the parents and the family who may be forcing them into this unwanted marriage or unwanted situation. So that's something we have to tackle at a policy level, and that also distinguishes our experience here in the US from what our colleagues in the UK are dealing with. Just a few comments about the tactics that were reported. As you can see, many of the respondents who answered the survey who've encountered forced marriage cases in this country said that the most common tactics were more subtle. It was emotional coercion, isolation and control, social ostracism, economic threats, threats of violence. One example I like to give, we were contacted on a particular case where a school had called the police because a father had been caught sneaking around school grounds, which he was obviously kind of sneaking. It wasn't like a parent coming in to drop off a, release form or something. And they didn't know who this man was. They thought it was, who knows who it was. So they called the police. It turned out to be a father of a student who was going around school grounds trying to spy on his daughter to check if she was wearing her hijab, because he suspected she might be taking it off during the school day. And this situation and this young woman were later involved in another series of violent incidences, but that was kind of a warning sign. It was a precursor. It let the school know, and thankfully the school was kind of on guard and aware that there was some kind of control, isolation, more severe parenting tactics than maybe we're normally used to in this country. So you have to watch out for those unique warning signs. A lot of people also reported violence, though. Again, we've heard a lot of examples of how these cases are very high stakes. And people did report that individuals who resisted forced marriages, who tried to say no, they were subject to immigration-related threats, being sent back to the home country, having status taken away from them. Parents can sponsor their children to get immigration visas. Spouses can sponsor, the other spouse. So can be a lot of control through immigration means in these situations. And we did hear about actual incidences of physical violence, death threats, people being kidnapped or forced abroad. Most frequently reported was through the individual being drugged and taken through airport security and basically told that they were either mentally incapacitated or ill, and so airport security didn't check. There are a lot of unique ways that people will go about trying to coerce someone into entering these types of arrangements. I share this slide just again to reinforce the high stakes. I think you guys have heard it a lot today, but the survey also reflected what the other speakers have presented on. We had 13 people say that they had encountered attempted murder attempts. We had 42 respondents say that the individuals they were trying to help had either attempted or actually committed suicide. So the individuals that we're trying to help, they're in really perilous and precarious situations, and we need to be sure that we're not just intervening at one stage, but staying with them through what can be sometimes a very long process to try to get them help. This is just a quick summary of the legal services that we're providing at Tahirih under our Forced Marriage Initiative. You guys, just like the detective, if you want to call on me as a resource, I'm, well, not always available. Unfortunately, not 24/7, but I put my card outside. You can always give me a call. We are able to take clients that are in our service areas and directly provide them with either immigration law representation, family law assistance, or social services. That's for the DC metro area, for Texas, and up in Maryland. For the rest of the country, we do provide national technical assistance and kind of resource coordinating assistance. And what that means is I get calls from police officers, from educators, from social service workers, from concerned friends, neighbors, relatives who are asking what can be done in these cases and how can I help this individual. And what I'll usually try to do, and I know Ahad does this as well, is try to identify service providers in their area that can assist them. We also do intake, we do emergency risk assessment and safety planning to try to help them if they're in a very specifically perilous situation. And we also provide continuing support for individuals so that there's someone who can kind of monitor the case as it's ongoing. Before I launch into how to identify victims, I do want to talk for a second about the laws that we have in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have a Forced Marriage Protection Act here. We don't have, criminal laws, which I think is an interesting debate that's ongoing in a number of countries around the world addressing forced marriage. At the federal level, I got to give a shout out to the State Department, there you go, who is really the one federal agency that's put themselves out there on this issue and really been available to intervene in specific cases. I'll talk a little bit more about how they do that in a second. And we will be having a webinar with them in the 3rd week of October where you guys can learn more about what can be done officially by the federal government if a U.S. citizen is taken overseas. At the state level, there are criminal laws against forced marriage in 9 jurisdictions. And unfortunately, though, they weren't really contemplating these situations. A lot of those laws are over 100 years old, and a lot of them are related to pandering, to protecting youth from being defiled. It's a very even interesting language choices that the statutes are using to describe a forced marriage. And in a number of these jurisdictions, I know in Minnesota, it's a crime to force somebody into marriage against their will, I think is how the statute reads, except in cases of parental consent. So we have these strange exceptions, strange wording of the laws, and I don't think any of these, though, have been used yet in cases, have been used to try to bring someone who's forcing someone into a marriage to justice in any kind of way. So I would encourage you guys to think creatively if you are, I realize I'm talking to New York right now, and you're not on that list, but as I give these talks around the country, we try to encourage people to think creatively how to use laws at hand, these laws, and then if you flip to the next slide, we have used protection orders, getting kids, taken into custody because of findings of abuse and neglect or that they're a child in need of services, pursuing emancipation has happened in a number of cases where we just had to do that to even be able to allow the person to access services. And also seeking annulments and divorces for individuals who are facing forced marriage situations. We can also use just our federal and state criminal laws, too. A lot of the elements that are involved in a forced marriage or honor violence situation include some of these crimes. If somebody's being restrained against their will, if somebody's the victim of domestic violence or assault as a way to force them into agreeing to this marriage or to punish them for some kind of behavior. even we've heard a few cases where trafficking laws have been invoked because there was an exchange of property or a large exchange of dowry and some other kind of compensation between families. And you couple that with the lack of consent or with the fact that the individual is a minor. And, you know, when they get married, if it's a forced marriage situation, they are facing rape, continued sexual assault, continued trauma. You can frame what's happening within the context of some of the laws that we have in existence right now. And then also, and this is what I do primarily, in my non-forced marriage world legal life, we assist victims of crimes under the various immigration laws that are out there. We've assisted for over 15 years women who have been fleeing forced marriages and situations of honor violence through U.S. asylum law. That's actually how our organization was founded. Our executive director helped in the first case. It involved a woman called Fauzia Kasinga, who was fleeing forced marriage and female genital mutilation in the Togo. And it was the first time that U.S. courts recognized gender-based crimes and persecution as a basis for getting refuge in the United States. That was back in the mid-90s. There's also the Violence Against Women Act, Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I don't know if you guys use U visas up here. We like them down in Virginia. To protect victims, encourage them to come forward and speak with police. All right, going on. So let's talk about some just practical tips, though, and about the reality. I want to share with you guys the reality I see when I get these calls, because it's really up to the front line, the first responders, whether, again, it's the police, it's that doctor who reached out for help, whether it's the school counselor that recognizes something is wrong. They have to take action and intervene, and then coordinate some kind of resources or reach out to somebody who can coordinate resources for the individual at risk. These are the dynamics I usually see in the cases that come to me. The individuals who are at risk are really oftentimes very tentative about taking any kind of action. I call it decision paralysis. All they know is they want the forced marriage to stop. They don't know exactly what else they want. They're worried about what's going to happen to their younger siblings. They're worried about what's going to happen to their parents. They have all these concerns and fears that you have to address as you're working with somebody to get them to a place of safety. They often have no idea that they have the ability to say no to a marriage here in the United States, that consent is needed in order to have a valid marriage. And so validating that, letting them know that it's okay to say no, is a really important part of the services you'll be providing. The threats often from many sources. You guys have already heard about that. I'm not going to talk about it more. I mean, the fact that we have to use organized crime style investigation and prosecution tactics to look at these cases, I think speaks a lot to the network that's involved to ensuring an individual behaves in the expected manner. We also have a lot of really urgent cases. We've gotten calls where somebody's going to be leaving in a day, a week, and that can put a lot of stress on frontline service providers trying to coordinate actions. I'll talk a little bit about what we do in those cases. And it's really hard when minors are involved, especially here in the US, where we have 50 different child protection services, regimens, and a whole bunch of different state statutes and laws. And it can be a real challenge. Parental rights are really protected in this country. And so to actually intervene and get a child out of the home can be a very challenging thing, but if you do it creatively, it can be done. And I'll share a case example where we were able to do that in Virginia. So I pulled these from this fabulous resource that I always refer to, the UK Multi-Agency Practice Guidelines, that I would advise you guys to check out. If you go to the Forced Marriage Unit's webpage in the UK, you can pull down the entire manual, which has specific guidance and tips for everyone from law enforcement to colleges, universities, service providers. They're really great tools. And one thing they talk about is the warning signs. For me, when I'm looking at a case, that history in the family, whether siblings have been forced to marry, is a really critical indicator. How did marriages come about for older siblings, older cousins, for their parents? I always look at, has there been any kind of self-harm or suicide attempts? With health issues, I mean, on every case I've encountered, there's been health issues. There's been visible signs of anxiety, depression that someone could be attuned to. And it often will grow and manifest itself in greater and greater and more visible ways the closer the marriage comes. So everything may be fine. And I know I was working with a school counselor, and she said, we saw this girl's grades plummet. She was an honor roll straight A student, and she began to get very anxious as summer break was approaching. And so we knew something was wrong. And then the question is, are you asking the right questions and trying to reach out and help that individual? Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. I'll speak a little more about the law enforcement issues, and you guys have already heard a little bit about this, but I can't emphasize enough how many times we see families trying to get law enforcement on their side in a case, especially when an individual has decided to resist a marriage, try to get out of a situation of honor-based violence, and takes the proactive step of leaving the family home. The first thing that happens, I've seen it happen within a half an hour of somebody deciding to leave, is the families will usually go to law enforcement and they'll file a missing persons report. They'll claim the kid is a runaway. They will claim that, like in the Noor al-Maliki case, there was some kind of theft. They'll claim that the individual is mentally unstable. We see that a lot, and that the family is just really concerned, needs to take care of them. Please help us find our child. Parents are really savvy, and they know how to work the U.S. law enforcement legal system sometimes. And so we have to be aware of that. And the tactics that we've used is we sometimes try to get to the police first, because we see you guys as our allies, service provider. I love working with the police. We have great relationships with our local police. And through cultivating that, if there's somebody in our area that's going to be leaving, I try to reach out to my local domestic violence investigator or whoever the liaison is that I have, let them know what I can about the situation, give them the heads up there may be these reports coming in so that they can better figure out how to respond and how to ensure the safety of the individual I'm trying to help, instead of letting the family access law enforcement resources to try to track somebody down. A history of domestic violence is also huge, especially when it's perpetrated against a young woman. I mean, again, many of these cases, it's an individual who's kind of just hit puberty to the kind of early to mid-20s. Forced marriage and honor-based violence occurs across the entire age spectrum, but there is kind of a time where I see it occurring more commonly, and I'd say it's those late 20s, early teenage years. And so it's really important to keep your eyes open when you're investigating domestic violence or family abuse situations. Also, if there's a history of other siblings running away, resisting, having interactions with law enforcement, it can all just be indicators of what's going on. And again, education issues too. I really personally think that schools are our front line, and that's a space often where someone who, even if they're in a kind of controlled and challenging situation at home, that's a space where they can reach out for help, look to learn a little bit more about the situation that they're in, have a confidential space to talk to somebody. So we reach out to educators. We've been doing a lot in the Northern Virginia area to try to make schools aware of what's going on. If you see any of these indicators, or you have any concerns about a situation that you're encountering, my bottom line is just ask. Unless we ask, the person may not just self-identify. And I always ask people to not say, are you being forced into a marriage? Because usually the person will not answer yes. You got to kind of ask a little bit more gently around the issues. Have you had a choice in deciding who you would marry? Are you having problems with your parents? If so, can you tell me a little bit about them? Are you facing do you have any concerns right now about your family situation? Do you have any upcoming travel you're concerned about? Depending on what factors and what information the individual's giving you, just kind of pursue those lanes and see what you can find out. But if you don't try to find out, then oftentimes the individual will not self-identify. We like to follow what the UK follows, which is, there's a one chance rule. If you don't reach out and try to talk to that individual, I don't know if they're going to be able to come back again for help later. I have some do's and don'ts. We're definitely still working on our best practices here in the United States. Again, we've looked a lot to what the UK has done and to what Canada's done, and we've taken a lot of lessons learned, and I think we're going to be able to jump ahead, hopefully, of the kind of 10-year backlog we have on dealing with this issue by being able to learn from individuals and talking to experts like Nazir and other people who have worked on this case. But these are the guidelines I follow as a service provider and that a lot of my colleagues follow, so I just wanted to share them with you. we definitely encourage you to interview individuals in a very secure and private space. They're sharing things that are very difficult for them to talk about a lot of the time. They're scared of how you're going to perceive them, how you're going to perceive their family, their community, what could potentially happen to them. And so they need a safe environment to be able to express openly what they need and what they want and what they're concerned about. I'm an attorney, so pretty much all conversations with my clients are confidential or service seekers, with very few exceptions. If you are a social service provider or an educator, or I'm not sure what the parameters are with law enforcement, oftentimes people are mandated reporters. And one thing that's very important to do is to let the individual know what are the limits to confidentiality. And I'll share just one example of that. We got a call from a local principal, and the individual actually self-identified to somebody at the school that they were potentially facing a forced marriage this summer and were going to be taken out of the country. And the individual is a minor. And we did not, the school was great. They didn't know what to do, but they tried to look up some resources and they gave us a call. It was going to take us a little while to get an emergency plan in place. It's hard to just find a safe location for a minor to go if they're facing a serious threat of violence. And in this case, actually, while there had been domestic violence in the family, there hadn't been violence around the coercion to get married. There'd just been threats. And the domestic violence is actually when the person was much, much younger. But I knew we'd have to ask questions about the family history. We'd have to ask questions about potentially family abuse and violence. And I didn't want the school to be in a position of having to mandate a report, because they didn't feel like the forced marriage was enough to cause them to be a mandated reporter, which is a whole other issue I'll get to later. But we wanted to give them some space. And so we talked to the school and we said, well, hey, for now, for today, can we have a space alone, a private confidential space to speak to this individual so we can get the whole story, make some decisions, figure out some options without you having to turn to Child Protective Services and the police. And I'll tell you the reason that we have to do that in my area. It's because unfortunately in a number of cases, Child Protective Services has learned of the situation and the first thing they've done is called the parents. So we were unsure as to exactly what the reaction would be, and we just needed to have a little bit of extra time. But again, knowing the limits of confidentiality is important to the individual that you're talking to. This is something else that's very important, is just respecting the individual's wishes. If they don't want to talk to somebody from their community, I respect that. If they do want to talk to somebody from their community, my approach is we'll discuss the safety of that and try to do kind of a risk assessment and see what service providers may be available. I do have some trusted people that are from certain communities where this issue is a serious problem, and I work with them, and I trust them. I have a good relationship with them. So again, I think it has to be looked at on a very case-by-case basis. Reaffirming the individual has the right to say no to the marriage is really important, and just reassure the person that no religion is sanctioning this, and that it's, a lot of times people do find themselves in crises of faith, and that can be tricky as law enforcement, as a service provider, to figure out what to say in those situations. I just try to be as reaffirming, open, honest, and caring as I can. This is probably one of the most important takeaways I'd ask you guys to bring with you. When we're doing risk assessment and safety planning for people that come to us for help, I always ask about and document the individual's perception of the risk. Other speakers have already talked about this. They know what goes on in their family. They know what they're going to potentially be facing. And it's really important to ask about that in multiple ways. What will saying no to the marriage mean? What actions could be taken? This is a question I ask all the time too. What's happened when you've said no in the past to something that your parents or your family wanted you to do? And I'll share an example. I was working on a specific case with an individual who was facing, again, being taken overseas for a marriage. And we were talking about her family history, and she kept saying there's been no domestic violence in my family. They're actually very loving and supportive in every other way. But you know, I just know that they're going to be reacting in a certain way if I say no. And when I've said no, it's led to huge fights and to threats, but no physical violence. However, then we started talking about the issue of honor and codes of conduct. And she shared with me, I'm like, just any incident, has anything ever struck you as strange or made you scared, you know? And she shared with me that when she was around 10 or 11, her father had always told her, you can't play with boys. It would just be a dishonor. You know, this isn't how our family behaves. This isn't. This is what we expect of you. And she was playing outside with her sister, and there was a neighbor boy across the street, and he ended up throwing a snowball at them. And the sister just went inside. I don't know exactly what happened, but she threw a snowball back. And before we knew it, there was this massive snowball fight. And she said, though, that her dad had been watching from the window. And when she got back inside, her dad was really upset, took her downstairs, and he had like a tool bench, grabbed a screwdriver, and was holding it and kind of pointing it at her throat. And he said, if you ever do anything like that again, you know what's going to happen to you. And he didn't need to say anything else. And she didn't see this as an incident of domestic violence. She just saw this as her dad kind of correcting her behavior. But to me, that's a huge indicator of potential physical harm and that there's risk involved in the situation that could quickly escalate. I also ask a lot of the time, actually all the time, explicitly, what are your wishes with regards to this situation? What do you want for the future? You're asking for help, you're reaching out for help. And it can be very difficult for individuals who are facing these situations. They may not know exactly what they want. Again, the comment I hear the most often is, I just want the marriage to stop. But I think it's very important, and we use this model at our organization, that the client is probably going to know best what is going to keep them safe and what remedies they want to pursue. And also, when we get these clients too, they're usually sometimes not in the most crisis of situations. They've kind of moved past that and gotten to a safe place, and we're helping them with their legal options. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. This is just an echo of what everybody's been saying, so I'm not going to go over it in detail. Don't use community members as interpreters if you can help it. You're just putting the person at greater risk. Don't share information. If possible, don't send the individual away if they're coming to you in crisis. We realize this can be very, very difficult if it's a situation involving a minor, but I think we can think creatively about how to not have a person go home if they've come and asked for help. We also, as a general rule, don't act as mediators. This can be tricky when you're involved in Child Protective Services cases and say there's a guardian ad litem appointed or some other court official who's trying to get the family to work situations out. Generally, we try to kind of excuse ourselves from that situation and stay focused on representing the individual at risk and discourage contact with the family. What we've seen, particularly after an individual has just left the home, they're usually in such a vulnerable place. They're missing their family, they're missing their siblings, they're missing their friends, that allowing that contact can cloud their vision, and they begin to believe the family's promises that if they go home, everything's going to be okay, we're going to change our mind, we won't force you to go through with this. These are just basic tips and advice. One thing I always ask people to do, we get a lot of requests for help initially over email, people emailing us from all around the country asking what I can do, even prior to them going to a local service provider, contacting the police. And I always try to make sure they have a secure email address. You guys as police, I'm sure, know this, but I can't tell you how many emails I get from people reaching out, asking for help, trying to keep their outreach secret from their family, that are from somebody with a first name, last name @Gmail email address, and then the password is like their cat's name. And so if somebody from the family was suspicious that they were trying to reach out for help or was clued in that they're trying to resist this marriage that they're potentially facing, it's really easy to go and find out what's in that email account. So we always advise them to set up a completely new email account, no identifying information, so they can have a safe means of communicating with either me as a service provider or whoever else is helping them with the situation. Always do a risk assessment and safety plan. And again, I think the other speakers have really eloquently talked about the differing dynamics that are involved when you're facing a situation of forced marriage or honor-based violence, and there's different things you have to take into account. So The next thing I want to turn to is responding to situations of imminent travel, because we get these a lot at our organization, and also to the reluctant sponsor scenario. It is really important to figure out someone's immigration status. We see cases manifesting in different ways depending on who the person is. If the individual who's reaching out for help is a United States citizen, a legal permanent resident, has other kind of status, then generally they're probably going to be either forced to marry in the US or forced to travel abroad for a marriage. And what we often see then is if they're forced to travel abroad, they may be then allowed to return and then forced to sponsor an immigration visa for the spouse. We've also seen situations where individuals have been forced to sponsor a visa for a fiance to come over, and then the wedding would take place in the United States. If the caller doesn't have stable immigration status, then oftentimes they are fleeing a situation in their home country, or we've seen a number of situations where it's been an arranged marriage, and the individual gets to the United States. It's not at all the situation that they expected. It becomes a situation of forced marriage, being forced to remain in this situation, and the abusive family members, spouse, whoever it is leveraging their lack of status as a means to keep them under control and not filing for the immigration status they would otherwise be entitled to. When we see situations where somebody might be potentially traveling abroad, these things manifest in a lot of different ways. We've seen situations, a number of them, where the threat's been really explicit. They've been told that, oh, that's not good. We have a spill of a soda. We've seen situations where somebody has been told basically for years, when you turn 16, you're going home to X country and we're going to marry you to this cousin or to whatever person the parents have decided. We also see much more subtle situations. And just to share some of the stories I've heard and the cases I've seen, not only going home to visit the sick grandma, but we've seen situations where somebody's going home, their parents tell them they get a trip to celebrate their high school graduation or their college graduation. We see situations where there is a death in the family that's not really a death in the family, meet cousins, but something isn't right. And oftentimes the victim, they'll know that. And what we've been told and what we've heard repeatedly is people are seeing situations where their parents are on the phone a lot. They're not letting them listening into calls with relatives back in the parents' home country. They're buying excessive amounts of gifts that maybe indicates it isn't just a family visit home. There's some kind of event or ceremony that's going to take place. Buying excessive amounts of jewelry, getting ready for something that's not just a visit to see grandma. And again, the individual who's at risk, she knows these signs, and she's going to tell you, and then that should make you guys aware of what they're potentially facing. And oftentimes, once they realize the travel is imminent, once the plane tickets are issued or purchased, that's when they reach out for help, which can make it kind of a race against time to get them the assistance that they need. So risks of going abroad. I mean, they should be fairly obvious, but I think things are even more acute in situations of forced marriage. We've seen situations where individuals may have been brought up speaking a certain language, but they're going to be traveling to a whole different region of the country where maybe the dialect is different enough that they would have trouble communicating with somebody. They have completely limited access to phone, internet, postal services. The first thing that usually happens when somebody goes abroad is that phone is taken away. All means of communication are cut off. The passport IDs are usually confiscated. Any money they have is taken away. We've seen a lot of situations where people are taken to very remote areas, and they don't even have a means to get back without alerting the other people in the community or their parents or family that they would be traveling. There's lots of different countries that have no protections for women and girls under their laws, and where they might even need permission of a male family member to be able to leave the country and come back to the United States, even if they're US citizens. The State Department, as I said, has been great with trying to work with individuals who have been taken abroad. And this country list, I hope it's as updated as possible, is actually a list of countries where they have specific advisories on their website that is right down there, where they kind of detail the situation that the individual would be facing if they were taken abroad, what the laws are in the country, what risks they'd be facing, what's the local contact information for the embassy or consulate in that region. And these are also countries where there have been documented cases of U.S. citizens being taken abroad and the State Department's been notified. But there are some challenges. I mean, I know states working as hard as they can, but they also tell us that when we're working on a case, we have to limit individuals' expectations. They can only assist U.S. citizens. If you're a legal permanent resident, if you're an asylee, there aren't protections you can access under the State Department right now. I know they're in development of their formal protocols for dealing with these situations, but I know also from working with them that if you're taken to a remote part of Afghanistan where consular officials can simply not go because of safety and security concerns, they aren't going to be able to go and try to rescue you, or it's going to be very, very challenging. And there's also limits to their mandate, just like Nazir was talking about in the UK. You know, once somebody is taken abroad, if they are able to be rescued, to get contact, to get the assistance that the State Department can provide, which can include things like getting emergency travel documents, arranging a flight, coordinating with local resources in country, like a local domestic violence shelter or some other safe location they can stay while they're awaiting that return flight to the United States. Once they come to the United States, that's the end of their mandate. And they have to work with NGOs and service providers and kind of pass the client off to get continued services. Can I do a time check? I have no idea where I'm at. Okay. Okay, great. This is the advice I give. And I would advise you guys to also give this advice if you encounter people who might be doing imminent travel abroad or suspect they're going to be taken abroad. I urge them absolutely not to go. A colleague of mine, her name's Jasvinder Sangera in the UK, she gives a great example of some advice they gave one time. The individual was actually going to the airport when she reached out for help, or just prior to going to the airport, and the Karma Nirvana organization, or Karma Nirvana, the organization in the UK that helped her, told her to put a spoon in her knickers, and it was effective. We've also heard of situations like that occurring in the US where someone's managed to alert airport security somehow to have that final chance to be interviewed with somebody away from their family, express a need for help, and hopefully get some kind of assistance. We arm the individuals with as much information as we can. Embassies, consulates, informations, local NGOs, shelters that we have contact with. And if you guys ever encounter cases, you can give us a call, you can give AHA a call, and I know we're all developing resources to be able to help individuals who might be taken overseas. We get as much information as we can. And I think, too, one of the most key things that we can advise is to tell the person to get, if they're determined to go overseas, get a secret cell phone. Get an extra SIM card. Get something that will enable you to communicate, even if it's only via text, with somebody back in the United States or with somebody in the country that you're going to. These are really critical things. We also try to come up with as many safety plans as possible, and we do airport and other kinds of contingency plans. And you can notify the State Department, and they will, of course, try to do what they can to help the individual abroad. Go to the next slide. Thanks. Just a quick note on reluctant sponsors. We've seen a number of cases, and I think these types of cases are going to grow here in the United States, where, like I said, individuals are being forced to sponsor spouses or to sponsor fiancés from abroad. It can be really difficult to try to safely withdraw a visa, especially if the individual who's being forced to do the sponsorship is still living with their family. Oftentimes, family members are controlling the entire process. They're restricting access to documents. We've had people lock mailboxes, so only dad can get in and see when there's been an official acceptance notice from DHS that this application's been filed. And then on the counter side to that, he would be the one to see if there was a receipt of withdrawal if you, as an immigration attorney, filed for a visa application to be terminated. So we have to think creatively about that. And we've been working with the Department of Homeland Security to try to put some safety measures in place in their systems. This is the last thing I want to talk about. Minors are really, really tough. We've had a number of cases involving minors in our service areas, and they are doubly vulnerable, I'd say, particularly under the laws that we have here in this country, and not even the laws, but just the protocols that our child protective services often have to follow. I don't know if we have anyone from CPS-like agencies here, but in Virginia and in Texas, the mandate is to try to reunite families if possible, and that can be putting you kind of at odds with what might be the best for the individual at risk. We also see situations where victims who are minors can't even really legally go in front of a court and ask for a protection order. They need a next friend. They need some kind of advocate or law enforcement officer, whomever, to take up their cause and kind of fight for them to get the legal protections that they need. State laws are really, that's one of our target areas, and I know we're looking forward to hopefully working with AHA on that situation, trying to ensure that state laws can get tweaked so that CPS sees forced marriage as falling squarely within their mandate and as something that constitutes abuse and neglect of the child, or at least qualifies somebody to be a child in need of services, even if there hasn't been violence already, but there's just that threat of violence in the family home. Just to speak quickly about a case that we did in Virginia, where we were able to actually get a protection order for a minor. So this young woman was a 16-year-old American girl who was facing a forced marriage overseas. Marriage was arranged by the parents, despite her telling them repeatedly. She knew about this marriage for 2.5 years before it was supposed to take place. They simply wouldn't listen to her. She tried reaching out to people at her local school who listened to her but didn't know what action to take, so they never reached out to any type of service provider or anybody else. They also, I think, might have thought she wasn't being as serious as she was being. What family would force their 16-year-old to leave this country and, go return to the parents' home country and get married at such a young age? She didn't reach out for help until her family began taking those concrete steps. Buying the plane tickets, she had to go out, and her mother bought all the clothes for the wedding. That's when she realized this is happening. I can't talk myself out of this. I can't resist. There was a history of past violence in the family, nothing very recent, but enough threats that she was at serious fear for her life. And she'd also been brought up, unfortunately, hearing stories about what would happen to girls in her communities who didn't go through with marriages, who disobeyed their family's wishes. And these stories, now she says, were kind of used to control her perception and her ability to try to resist this situation. We got contacted by a school official, who finally decided, wow, this girl is really in crisis. Her grades plummeted, which again is something we see very typically in these situations, and she also began skipping school. So it became a bigger issue than just her saying there might be a forced marriage in my future. We were able to meet with her. Again, this was another school that was great about securing a private space and allowing us to talk to her in confidence before any steps were taken, because she wasn't quite ready to leave home. She said, I'm not ready yet. Let's get some plan in place. I need to know my options before I just leave. She also had younger siblings she was concerned about. What's going to happen to them if she goes? Could her next youngest sister just be substituted? There were a lot of considerations in this case. We explored housing options, discussed pros and cons. We went through everything. Man, what can we do? We couldn't find any shelters that would take this young woman in, unfortunately. And we went through with her, what it's going to mean if you leave the family, what risks are there, what's the threat of retaliation, what's it going to mean for your future, not having communication with the family, for your own safety if you decide to take that step. CPS was notified after we had time to kind of safety plan with the girl, because we wanted to see what they would do. And unfortunately, CPS wasn't able to open an investigation, again, because there hadn't been violence perpetrated on her or her siblings, and the threats didn't quite amount to enough for them to consider it to fall within their mandate. We were really disappointed by this, but whatever, you got to move forward. We ended up deciding we had to go to court. We were going to try to get a protection order. In Virginia, minors can't go before the court to ask for a protection order. They have to have some kind of next friend, guardian, someone who's going to be reaching out on their behalf. Family members obviously weren't going to do this, so we decided to do it as her attorney. We didn't even know if we could legally enter into a client-attorney relationship with her, but we investigated that and decided to just go forward with it, and it ended up working out. We were able to bring the petition as her next friend, and what we did, we almost prepared this like an asylum case. We documented, we did a really long affidavit from the girl talking about these past threats, the home environment she was growing up in, exactly what she was worried about if she resisted the marriage. And we researched the country she was going to be going to. And we had country condition reports. We had news reports about incidences of forced marriage and honor-based violence in that country. And that was all instrumental in getting the judge to believe us when we went in front of them. We also, in addition to filing for the protective order, we also alleged that there was a situation of abuse and neglect predicated on the fact that if she was forced to go abroad and marry, she would be subject to repeat sexual assault. So, to go to the next slide, we got it. We got the preliminary protective order. We were actually able to have the young woman remanded into our custody, and we were able to find her a safe and secure place to live. And she was able to be out of the family home for a number of weeks until that next hearing. So she had a moment to decide what she really wanted, what her next steps were going to be. There was a fantastic guardian ad litem appointed in the case who basically represented her interests. And that was really nice because we could really, the guardian was looking at what was best for her in the aggregate and the whole, where we were her advocates. So there were two roles that were coming together to kind of advocate for her protection. And ultimately, the young woman actually did decide to go home. And in this situation, it was interesting. What we did is kind of what the UK does with their protection orders. We technically folded a protective order into a child in need of services determination, and this judge that we worked with confiscated the girls' passports, mandated that the parents not travel and not take this young woman outside of a certain mile radius until her 18th birthday. The judge instated continued monitoring by the court, mandated that she stay in her own school as part of her protection plan in place for her, and she was able to return home. And we had some reservations about her going home. I don't know if I would advise that in this situation, but that was her decision. But we are there, and she can call us at any time. And we do talk to her regularly. Her guardian talks to her regularly. Other people involved in the case talk to her regularly. And she knows she can reach out if she feels like the threat is escalating. She can't easily be taken out of the country because her documents are not available. The family knows it's being monitored. And it created a resolution to the situation. We'll see how it is in a few years. Again, I know a lot of times that these cases will flare up, and there might be another big issue when she turns 18 and tries to leave the family home. But for now, we are at least able to prevent her from being taken abroad at 16 and get her some kind of network of support and protection in place. Thanks, guys. They hired an attorney, and they battled us pretty strenuously. No, they did not, and I think that was another huge factor in the case. They said, yes, we had arranged a marriage for her, and she was going to go overseas and get married. And that was a pretty blatant admission, and it really helped with us shoring up our case. But it was a very complicated situation, and we see this very often where it's like you're putting in protections that may be temporary, then you're going to revisit it again. You know, we also, in general, I encourage people to leave, you know, if they can. And with most of our clients who aren't minors, they do end up relocating, and we assist them with that relocation process.
Is there a way once one girl family has been given protection like that to gift other siblings, younger siblings copies?
Yeah. The judge was aware that there were other siblings in the situation, and while she couldn't officially extend the order, because that wasn't how the law worked in that state, she included in her decision like some discussion of siblings and protection for the whole family, and was aware of the situation. Again, though, when we look at what the UK offers, which is a much more flexible protection order, in situation of forced marriage, which is actually something we're pursuing at Tahirih, trying to draft legislation so that we can get something similar in the U.S. that would allow for siblings to be covered. It has extraterritorial jurisdiction, if I'm not right. It's a much more flexible document, and it doesn't stick as strictly to the definitions of, like, say, abuse and neglect or domestic violence that a lot of protection orders are constrained by. You have to meet that threshold. It allows for a little bit wider interpretation of threat and risk, from my understanding. So we need something like that in the U.S., and that's one thing as a policy organization we're trying to do in coalition with the other good organizations working on this issue.